brighter. And then you can also change like okay with you? Yep. I know, it's like a cabinet table.
I picked up something for you. The last time I was here, I didn't get it out. Hello. You're the Orphan Train man? Do you correspond with other people who speak on the Orphan Train?
Yeah.
We heard some person at the teachers meeting a year ago. I can't recall her name.
Whereabouts is that?
You know, where was that? It was in northern Iowa,
That's why it's Spencer.
where Donna Reed lives. Sheridan? No, not Sheridan.
No,
Up on Highway 30. Yeah. Denison. gave us a really nice biography of Orphan Trains. And I was going to. Yeah, I actually read it. Yeah.
Yeah, they check that books up there.
Okay.
So I guess if the group just wants to go to another room, that's probably easiest. We felt like we wanted to.
I'm going to go over here and look at books.
Okay, yeah, that's right. I saw this was over here, so.
This is Wendy's treat.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
No, actually, it's our elderly dinner lunch. Yeah, yeah.
No. Yep.
Just as a disclaimer, because we have people online that will be listening, they won't hear the questions, so when you get a question,
Lady talked last week
phrase
was
the
from
question, that way they can
Maryland, I mean, from
Thank you. So,
and that's Western
and then
Center. And you can go and like,
kick things off too.
and if you want to, Westwood magnet, you got that.
Test.
You have these,
Yeah, that is new.
yeah. Okay. A lot of people. Yeah. Wow. How are you? He has his card. Yeah. So thank you for giving me that book. I'll give it back to you. Oh, I think I'll try to still read a little of it, you know. Yeah. So, yeah, well, I thought it was interesting and, you know, it moved right along. So, I got that at the library. And so, I got it in the library. Yeah, do you have it? No, okay. Okay. They'll check and they'll let you know if they can get it. Yep. And, you know, the thing is, if you order 2 or 3 books at the same time, you get them all. Yeah. There.
Let's see, I think we're about ready to.
Okay.
Pat's watching that. We thought we had about everybody. There were more than students. Oh, yeah. Yeah, here's Don and Donna, and they just walked in, so. What do you think? We
Yeah.
still had some people registering, but we're gonna. They started that.
Hello. I haven't seen anybody for so long.
I know.
Good to see you.
Good to see you too.
everyone. Here we are again for another exciting presentation in our Brown Bag series this year, and it is continuing to be so good to get back together in person. Thank you very much for coming. We appreciate your attendance very much, and we certainly appreciate those who are joining us virtually, and that too is a wonderful opportunity that's been sort of a hidden benefit from this COVID winter. And if you have that link, you can also check it in an archive setting and watch at a later time as well. It is an exciting presentation today. We are very pleased to have Dennis Wilson from Mason City, Iowa, and his wife is joining him as well. Anna Marie, you just wave there in the back. We're very glad to have you too. Dennis Wilson is a retired Canadian Pacific Railroad conductor, and they are married with two children and two grandchildren. He serves on numerous boards in the church and in the city, and presently he is on the North Iowa Area Community College Advisory Board for the Lifelong Learning Program. I think he epitomizes lifelong learning. A member of the Trinity Lutheran Church in Mason City, the Evening Lions Club, and the Winnebago Scout Council. He's a writer and a speaker on articles that have appeared in the Iowan, Our Iowa, Trains, and Northwestern Railway magazines. He's presently working on a book with a very intriguing title. It is called The Retirement Myth. Now, if we want to interject what we think the thesis of the retirement myth is, I think many of us can identify with that as well. So we look forward to hearing more about his book, perhaps. But he's an activist in restoration and preservation. But most importantly, and today, Dennis is our speaker as an advocate for the Orphan Train history recognition. He's spoken on this subject throughout the state. And last week when we were discussing this upcoming program, several of you raised your hands that you had family interests and connections to the Orphan Train. We're going to be so interested in hearing his talk about particularly the trains that came through Iowa, three of which, as we know, were through here in Mount Pleasant. Two in 1898 and one in 1900. So without further explanation, we're eager to hear Dennis Wilson's presentation on the Orphan Trains through Iowa.
You hear me all right? Okay. Well, it's great to be here. I didn't know I was going to make it down tonight. We left Mason City yesterday in a raging blizzard. We got about my way really, and then it cleared up a little bit. But it's so great to be here. It's been a long time since I've been here. Last time I was here, Johnny Cash was headlining out here at your flagship show. So that's been some time ago. And it's great that my wife and I took a drive out around there yesterday, and the place looks real nice. We really keep it up. It's a great asset to this community. It's a system like no other. It's a system that exists in this country for some 75 years. It involved moving by force children, overpopulation of children out of the eastern seaboard to every state in the territory. It's a system that has about 4 million descendants today. It's a system called the Orphan Train. You all know it by the Orphan Train. You read books about the Orphan Train. But actually, when they come here in 1889, they come here twice. In 1889, sent with the New York Juvenile Asylum. And then there was a group that come in 1900, sent by the New York Children's Aid Society. And if you would have said to somebody in 1889, said, I understand the Orphan Train's coming to town in Mount Pleasant, they'd have said, what are you talking about? Because they never called it the Orphan Train. The Orphan Train actually was tied to it by a New York newspaper reporter who thought it kind of would tie the whole package together, talking about these children in about 1900. Before that, they were known as placing out trains, baby trains, migrant trains, and no other names. Now I want you to stop and think about this a little bit. And I'm just going to bring this up. Don't take it seriously. But did you see the headlines the other day in, I think it's the Southeast Union Journal newspaper? There's a busload of kids coming out, about 42 kids coming out of Chicago tomorrow. About 20% of them are orphans. The others are abused, unwanted kids who live in the street. They range in the ages of 4 to about 13. And they're coming to Mount Pleasant. But they're going to take them down to Faith Lutheran Church. They're going to be down there about 2 o'clock, and they're going to line them up. And you can pick out the one you want. You want a boy, you want a girl, you want to take from the lady in the house, you want a girl to help you in the kitchen, fine. If you're a man, you want somebody to help you out in the field or around the shop. Pick one out. Maybe you can get 2. And the neat thing about this is, if they don't work out for you, you can send them back. Now you're sitting there thinking, and I know, you can't do that. You can't just go to work and line up kids somewhere and take home the one you want. That just isn't done. But they did it 1854 to 1929 for 75 years in this country. You don't see it in history books. You don't read about it a lot. But they did do this. This is we're going to try to answer a lot of questions about this as we go along. The Orphan Trains covered every state and territory of the Union, about 300,000 children. Now here's one of the problems. I've got some books here you can look at afterwards. I'm not selling books, but you can get them on the Amazon, and I've got a few up here. But every time I give a presentation, I always have this. 300,000 children was somewhere in that neighborhood. I don't know, 200,000, 999 or whatever, but somewhere in that neighborhood. People are saying to me, I just read a book. I just seen PBS. They said 150,000 children were shipped on the orphan train. And somebody else will raise their hand, no, I read a book said 40,000. And somebody said, well, I just got to read the book, it's 10,000. Well, they're all right, because the books you read, primarily, the books you read are written by the agency that's quoting those numbers. For instance, the PBS clip that you've seen from time to time on television is the Children's Aid Society. The Children's Aid Society sent more children than any organization, about 150,000. The other organization is the Catholic Society. The New York Founding Association was shipped about 40,000. Then there's the Boston Little Wanderers, shipped about 10,000. So you see, there's many different agencies, and that's where the confusion comes about. Overall, there's 191 different agencies over this period of time. The earliest one we can really define is a little back in about 1840, if you want to call it. It wasn't an orphan train, but they shipped some orphans in one part of Boston, another they called them streetcar orphans. Actually, the first shipment of children by train, nobody knows, but it was going on in the late 40s and early 50s to around in the eastern part of the United States. Connecticut, down in Virginia, places like that. As soon as the railroad started running, they started to fit out this population a little bit in these larger cities. Now, I don't know where you first heard about the orphan train, but I'll share a little bit about the first time I heard about the orphan train. I was in 6th grade in country school. Anybody here went to country school? I understand you're going to have a program later on in that. It's going to be very interesting. But I went to country school in Danville Township, Worth County, way up on the north. And one day Mrs. Cleveland said, you know, I got a surprise for you. There's an orphan writer coming to school to tell you about her experiences. We were so excited. We'd never seen an orphan before. So That following Wednesday, Helen Hickok come to our school and she told about her experiences. She told about experiences in growing up in an orphanage. She's told about being gotten one day and put with a group of children, put on a train, sent to Chicago, Minneapolis, and finally from Minneapolis down to the Rock Island to Northwood. The year was 1913, July 23rd. I got a newspaper clipping on it that's telling you about these kids coming to town. Helen said she lived in the orphanage till she's about 7. And they took her and brought her with these other kids, put all brand new clothes on them. They got all of the new clothes and traveled with the train. And she said, the only thing I remember about that train ride, we had mustard sandwiches and half rotten apples. Got to Northwood. Newspaper clipping says that day the streets were filled with buckboards and wagons and people parked. People come from Northern Iowa and southern Minnesota all over. Not so much to get a kid, because when they got to Northwood there was only 16 of them. But they went to see these kids. I mean, these kids, it's been in the newspapers about these kids in New York. They were prostituting, they were robbing, they were killing, they were murdering. They were just thick, and your life was in danger to walk around New York City. So they wanted to see these kids. And just like the buses coming to Mount Pleasant tomorrow, there was protests. There was people that didn't want these kids. We don't want these children here. If those children go to my school, I'm going to take my kids out. If those kids come to my church or my church, I'm not going. But that didn't deter people. There's always protests like that whenever there's change, something else coming in the community. So Helen said they got to Northwood, they loaded them in a wagon, they took them down to the Dual Opera House. And they put them on the stage, lined them up there, and in a matter of minutes they were gone. The newspaper says this: in a very short time, they were disposed of. What am I here talking about, kids? They were disposed of. And there were so many people wanted those kids, they didn't have enough, so they run another train in September. Well, Helen said that there was an older couple that got her. Now, in every train that went out with kids, there was an agent, depending on the number of the kids. If they had a full car, maybe there'd be 2 agents. But an agent that traveled with these kids for 40 years, Clara Comstock was her name, was the agent of that train. And she was supposed to check out the people that got the kids, and make sure that they'd be good parents. Now, here's one of the things that they had to do. They had to do that here in Mount Pleasant with the bus killer. They had to get about 4 of your prominent, most outstanding citizens to act as a committee. And if you wanted a kid, and that's why I say if you want to go down to the church tomorrow and get a kid, you have to go through the committee first. They would interview you and see if you'd make a good parent. So, there was a committee in Northwood too, upstanding citizens that would interview you, and then if you were passable by it, you would get a chance to take a kid. Well, they talked to this older couple, and they were kind of leery about it, but they knew Frank and Helen because they had a farm just outside of Northwood, so they couldn't very well turn them down. So they got Helen. And they took her out to the farm. It was about 2 hours, maybe hour and a half buggy ride. And they didn't speak to her. She was hungry, hoping she'd get something to eat. They got there, and she started crying. And the woman told her, said, if you don't quit crying, I'm going to put you in a cellar. Now, she didn't even know what a cellar is. Maybe you don't know what a cellar is, but I think most of you do. It's, you dug a hole in the ground, put a house on top of it, door on the outside, great big door on the outside that you open up to go down. They store the potatoes and stuff down there during the wintertime. It's a darn dungy place. I know, because one time my friend was playing around. I lived on a farm, and I went down in the cellar. My friend closed the door and locked it. I was down there for an hour. It wasn't my friend anymore. But it's really a terrible place to be for a kid. But Helen wouldn't So this lady took her, put her down in the cellar, and said, you're going to stay down there till you quit crying. And Helen said that she actually thinks she passed out. She cried and cried. Do you imagine a little kid like that down in a hole in the ground? The next morning, this is one of the things the agents did. The next morning they would get a buggy, and they'd go out and they'd go all the places where people had taken the children, and they'd inspect the hole and see how these coming along. The first place she went was this couple who had taken Helen. And she asked the lady, where is she? And she said, well, she's out in the field with a mister. And about that time she heard this cry. She went around the house, went right to the cellar door and opened it there. So I grabbed her. And Claire took her to another farm nearby. She knew wanted children and hadn't gotten any. They had 3 children. They took her, they raised her. She went to high school in Forest City and college at Waldorf. And when she come to our school, she was married, she had a family of her own, and she lived in Lima. What a story. I'd never heard this before, and I heard that in 6th grade. As I grew up, I went to work and got involved in other things. When I retired, I went back to school, get a degree, and they asked me, they knew I worked in the railroad, they asked me if I'd do a railroad program for lifelong learning, and I did. I spent about a year researching that, and then going through that, almost every community I looked at mentioned about children coming by train. So that's where I got my interest in the orphan train, and for the past 10 years I've been researching this, finding out something new all the time, and really checking into it, because I want to get the facts on it, and there's a lot of misunderstanding on it. How many of you read this book, The Orphan Train, by Christine Baker Klein? That is quite an interesting book. She was at Nyack, Bay City, North Island Community College, and spoke there on this book. In fact, I had a chance to have dinner with her. And she had never heard of the Orphan Train until she was out to her parents. I think it was even north of South Dakota, just sometime, I think Thanksgiving or something, and she was looking around in the library of the house there. They had a bunch of books. She found this book on an orphan train reunion. From that, she got interested in the orphan train and wrote this book. A very interesting book, and she's a very interesting lady in the research she done on this book. Okay, the question comes up. Why was there 300,000 children in the eastern seaboard, in Boston, Philadelphia, New York, primarily New York? With 1940, there was about 30,000 homeless kids on the streets, and after the Civil War, there was one of them. But why? Well, one of the reasons is anytime you have a community where you come together and settle in your village, and suddenly you're a big city, you have a huge population. We use London as an example. You have a high mortality rate. High mortality rate with the alcoholism, with diseases, with the living conditions, and parents don't live long. That would be not unusual. My great-grandmother was married when she was 15, and I imagine this is common among a lot of the older families. I think they have 11 children. And in our township, that was not uncommon. But mothers had a tendency to die, sometimes fathers, and it didn't work. It worked a hardship, but usually in big families, like the children were given to aunts, uncles, or somebody like that. But in a situation where you have a sudden migration in the cities, your population grew. Look at 1800, 60,000. But pre-Civil War, you're up to almost a million. 1870, a million, just about a million. They were coming in from all over Europe. There was not the housing, there was not the facilities to care for them. 100,000, 30,000 horses.
Sorry, we're having a little technical difficulty online, so I'm going to have to shut you off there.
Okay, just switch the mics
Never
here.
show if you don't have a technical
horses, each producing maybe 10 pounds of manure a day, well, that's quite a problem. You had a situation, no sewer, water, social system, corruption, and a lot of ethnic division. Because every time you come to New York, what did you do? You look for your group, Italian, Greek, German, Chinese, or whatever, to settle there. So it was a problem. You had 60,000 people who were the age of 10 could not read or write. So when mothers died young, fathers left. And here's another thing. They call it the orphan train, and only about 20% of these kids were actual orphans, where they didn't have a father or a mother. They may have had a father, they may have been half orphans, but most of them was just, was no home. They left the home, and they didn't get cared for. Okay, here's some people that just come into New York, and you look how bewildered they are. Have you ever been, if you want to experience, been over in a foreign country like Italy, and suddenly you don't have a passport, you don't have a billfold, you can't speak the language, you know how they feel. They're looking for someplace they can go, probably if they're Italian, they'll go to the Italian group. There's a picture of the living quarters. That's not a clear picture, but it was taken by Jacob Reese. And it shows them in this apartment in the tenement, and they would sleep in shifts. And then here's a picture of 5 kids. You look at that picture real close, there's 5 of them. This was taken by Jacob Reese. And if anything, I got some books over here I told you about to look at. If you care to, you can get them through Amazon. But here's a must-read for anybody who wants to know something about the Orphan Train, Jacob Reese. He was a photographer. He was a journalist during the Civil War. And he took thousands of pictures on conditions in New York at this time. Another thing, there's a couple of books over there about New York. If you want to really know, I just give you a little sample of what life was like there. Those would be good books to read. Wash Day in the tenements. 4 stories. Those buildings are put up. They didn't have electricity. They didn't have bathrooms. They didn't have central heating. They were fire traps. Disease went through there just rapid. And this is Wash Day. If you were a young woman, by the time you went downstairs, behind each one of those tenements, there was a roll of privies, a pump, a trough, where they washed their clothes in. You dumped them in a little stream that run by there. It wasn't the best of conditions. There's Mulberry Street. Charles Dickens walked down through there in about 1840 in one of his writings on this. He said the stench was so bad it'd curl the hair on your arms. Those awnings, beautiful awnings. When you ever see an awning, you think of it to keep the sunlight out. Those awnings originated in London. There was a rule that you had to dump your chamber pot from 5 to 7 each morning. If you don't know what chamber pot is, just ask your neighbor. I'm sure they do. But what they had to do, can you imagine you're on the 4th floor of a tenement, you run down, you got 5 or 6 chamber pots to take down, back to the privy, dump them and run back up? No, you open the window and toss them out. That's what those awnings originally was, to protect people from the stuff being thrown out of the window. The same reason that there's a common practice for the man to walk outside and the lady would be walking down the street so you don't get things thrown on you. Child labor law. Child labor laws. There's some boys working in the coal mine, night shift, 1873. There's some 90-year-olds working in the glass factory. And there's some New York newsboys. They were a tough little bunch. If any of you have a chance, I say this ought to be on every coffee table. It's the Orphan Train, written by Renee Rindiger. It tells a story about this group of boys. There was about 2,000 of them selling papers for about 185 newspapers in the city. Tight-knit little group. We didn't have child labor laws. In fact, we never got a real child labor law until 1938. That was pretty well watered down. And as early as 1960s, we were still fighting to get a better child labor law. You look at those boys, they're probably 7, 8, 9, 10, somewhere in there. They employed a lot of them. They worked 10, 12 hours a day in their bathroom is that bucket right there. There's Molly. There's thousands of mill girls in the city of the textile mills. If you want to know a mill girl, ask her to hold up her hand. If her thumb is missing, you know she works in the mills, because that's a common practice to have lose a thumb in that. Charles Warren Brace. A lot of books you'll read about, and I have this book. This is the second book. If you really are interested in Orphan Train, the dangerous classes of New York in 20 years working among them. He tells about his life working with these children. He was a graduate from Yale, and he was going to be a pastor. He started the Children's Aid Society in 1853. Him and two other fellows got together. They seen what was going on in New York, and they wanted to do something about it. Nobody was able to seem to work with this group of children, these thousands of kids. Somebody said he would take one out of the group. It's just like taking a teaspoon and taking the water out of the ocean. So he started some schools, and he founded the New York Children's Aid Society, which basically, we think of people, you read a book and it's, well, that's the train that brought the kids out of New York. Brace started, what he did was, these trains were already taking kids out of New York and other places, not in great quantities, but they thought it might be an answer to it. They were doing it in Europe. They took them by the thousands out of London to Australia. You hear about the criminals, but you never hear about the orphans being taken over. They also took them to Canada. And over 100,000 were taken to Canada and put in home schools. Now, they didn't call them orphan trains. They call them home kids. And 1 in every 10 Canadian is a descendant of these home orphanages. And then distributed them out from there. But Brace knew about this. He traveled to Europe, and he knew about starting something like this. So this is what he did. He didn't only run the train out of them. He consolidated it together so that it became an operating, feasible system. And you know, you've seen people that have great ideas, but they never could put the system together so it will actually work. But that's what he did. So he started over 120 different schools. And his idea was to get the kids out of the city, get them away from this. Hell, the little girl I told you about in Northwood, she'd never been out of the orphanages that she can remember. She had no idea who her parents were because she'd been found in a cradle in Gibble's department store. A lot of the department stores had cradles in them to put these unwanted babies. So he started all of these different schools, plus many more, including a school for colored children, which was very uncommon for somebody to do that at that time. What a story of every one of these. His theory was that he could take a kid and give that kid a faith in God, an education, and a skill by what he could support himself, his family, and his community, he would become a worthwhile citizen. Not such a bad idea today. Now there's the Children's Aid Society. Now, get this straight, you're going to read this in books. He didn't start an orphanage. He had an assembly point for bringing these kids together, putting them out on the trains and shipping them out. He had a system to do this. One of the things, pointer here, I guess working. But there's one of New York's gangs. The story that Reese has there, and a couple others, books that I showed you, tell a story about these young gangs that they had, and they were very dangerous, very mean, because they grew up in the mean streets in New York. And there's a little boy, that's one of the ways they made money. He was a shoe shine boy. And that's one thing they could do, they get a box and some brushes, they can shine shoes. These little fellas, boys and girls, are very enterprising. And sometimes they're dangerous. One of the things they would do is crawl up on the roofs and pry the lead from around chimneys, and many of them fell off and got hurt. That was just... There's a picture of two boys, Reese, the man I was telling you about here, who wrote that book and took all those pictures. He was walking down the streets in 5 Points, one of the toughest areas of New York, and he seen these 2 boys standing there, and he says, "Where do you live?" And they said, "We don't live nowhere." That came out in 1940, I think, on the front page of Life magazine. But so common with kids at that time, and even today in our cities. Now, how do the Children's Aid Society work? Remember, I told you there's different agencies. This is the Children's Aid Society. And what they did, they would go out in the streets, they would see kids, say, "Where do you live?" "Well, you got a home." "Where's your mom and dad?" "I don't know." "Well, we come to us. We got a bed for you, we got some food." The next week they're on a train going out west to find a new family. Well, what they did was they would send a point man out, let's say Mount Pleasant. And he'd stop here and he said, would you like to have any children? And then he says, "Yeah, we'd like to have some." "All right, here's what you do. You get a committee of your most prominent people. They act as a committee and you interview the people that want kids. And you pick out the ones you think will make good parents. And we'll be here in 3 weeks. We'll a train. We'll bring the kids here. You find a place to line them up, church, hall, on the train depot platform." And then they put out Dodgers. They didn't call them posters, they called them Dodgers. And they posted thousands of these on fence posts. And everywhere there was a place where you could go by with your buggy or wagon or somewhere going into town. And it tells about homes wanted for children. And here's another one, children want homes. And it gives all the details. And if you notice, they got the committee listed there too. Here's Clara Comstock. Now that's a misprint of that slide. It's 22 years. It's 42 years she's been traveling with these kids. She loved working with them. And there was hundreds of other agents too, but she's probably the one. There was a book written about her, and the most prominent person. There's also Mrs. Tate and Mrs. Hale and Mr. Tate. And there they are with a group of children. She was a very good friend of Clara's. There's a picture of some children. We just found out about 2 years ago that was taken in Wakan, Iowa. And here is Clara and Mrs. Hill, I think, with some boys getting ready to leave New York. There's some children they are going to Texas. These are New York newsboys. I imagine it's quite an adventure for them. And they had enough of the streets of New York, so they are going south. Here's some boys in 1910 were going to Louisiana. And here is a common practice, a wealthy individual. He's paying for a carload of kids to go somewhere, Nebraska or Iowa, and he paid for the whole thing. And there's quite a few people that did that, and then they come back, they get together their cocktail party, and they say, "Guess what we did?" And somebody else would hear it and say, "Well, maybe I'll try that too." So there were some wealthy people that had it needed. Okay, there was a problem in New York, infanticide, the killing of infants. It was really a serious problem. It had been going on for a long time. It was not uncommon for a police officer to be out walking his beat and find a baby in a garbage can or somewhere else. That's what prompted the department stores to put these cradles in there for women to put their babies. Nobody knows how many went down the Privy or how many went out in the Bay, but it was a serious problem. The Catholic Church had tried to do something about it, and other churches had too, but it just seemed so much of a problem. Like Brace did say this, is my job, the best I can do is take care of the living. Well, a young girl by the name of Irene Fitzgibbon from the family Fitzgibbon, quite wealthy in New York. She was a debutante. She was been educated abroad, quite wealthy family. She got sick, and in those days, they would go to work, and you didn't go to the hospital. They'd bring the hospital to you. And so she was in a coma, and
funeral. And during that time, at night, she had a dream, and she dreamt all these kids were coming up out of the bay. All the kids had been disposed of. Suddenly, were alive in the streets of New York. Well, she come to a bunch of the joy of her parents and others, but then they weren't too happy when she told them I decided to become a nun. Now, young, wealthy women in that status did not become nuns at that time. Most of the women that went in was a lower economic level, but there really no place else to go. Well, they couldn't talk to her, and she became a nun. And the church was kind of pleased with this because they didn't have too many fiery little red-headed Irish ladies that wanted to become nuns. She went up to the ranks pretty fast, and they decided to give her that building, and that building's in New York for your New York visit, and $5 and 2 helpers. I said, can you do something about appendicitis? So they started in. They started putting that hole, the first night they put one cradle in, and there was a baby in that cradle almost within an hour. And then he put some more cradles in, and that's where the New York Founding Association started, 1869. If you want to really read a book that covers that too, this the Orphan Trains, Newsboys in New York. What they did was the mothers could bring the babies, and then they could work, and then come and nurse the babies and see them at the orphanage. Well, many times the mothers got arrested for prostitution, a murder, a robbery, or something like that. They went into prison and they didn't get out, maybe 1, 2 years or whatever, and they come to the orphanage, the baby's gone, shipped out. And there is a number of letters in this particular book I just showed you, heartbreaking letters that tell about mothers who have tried to find their babies and couldn't find them. They started in 1881, trains themselves, orphan trains. And they started running out to various places, only they did it in a little different way. Now, Grace, I told you, the Children's Aid Society would ship the children out. The committee would interview them. The agent would go around, check the homes, and then they were supposed to write a letter to the Children's Aid Society once a year, and then they were supposed to come back, the agent, and check on it. Did it happen all the time? No, they didn't come back all the time and check. This was a little bit better system. They give away over 40,000 kids, basically. What they did, and I'm going to use Doherty, Iowa as an example. Doherty is an Irish community. And I got a copy of a barn burner of a sermon that the priest gave in Doherty. And he said, you people ought to be ashamed of yourself. You're living in fine homes. You got these beautiful fields out there, acres and acres of corn. And these kids are in the depths of debauchery in New York. They're dying. You ought to be able to help them out. So people said, maybe we ought to do our Christian duty. I'll use the example of Mr. and Mrs. O'Reilly. Okay, Mr. and Mrs. O'Reilly decide they're going to get a dog. He says, well, I can use a strong young man in the farm out there in the field. You can use a girl in the kitchen. Your daughters are all left home. So they go up the table. They say they'd like to get a kid. And they say, okay, you're number 26, 27. They telegraph into the Founding Association. Have you got... And first they ask him, what do you want? He said, well, I want a young man about 10 years old, pretty strong, will work real hard. And Mrs. O'Reilly said, yeah, I want a girl, but I want her about 8 years old. I don't want any... I've read about these kids, and I don't want any sassy young girl, especially I don't want a redhead Irish girl. So, okay, so they telegraph him. The orphanage goes to work and, looks around through the kids, finds somebody close to what they want. A couple weeks later, a train arrives in Doherty. And they all have brand new clothes on. The town all knows about it. They all come down to see these kids. They take them down to the church, line them up, and, priest gives a talk, and then they start calling out numbers. And Mr. and Mrs. O'Reilly comes up, give their number, 26, 27. And he looks at the boy, he checks his teeth, checks his hair, checks his muscles. He looks like he'd make a fine young man. I could really work him and train him the way I want him to work. Mrs. O'Reilly looks at the girl and she says, I don't want her. And she takes her hair and she rubs it. Said, I think that's dyed hair. I think she's a redhead. And besides, she looks sassy and she's too skinny. I don't want her. Mr. O'Reilly tries to talk her into taking her, but no. So he takes the boy. And if the girl isn't given away that day, she's going to go to the next town and the next town. If she isn't taken, she's sent back. The sad thing about this, that girl is that boy's sister. And this happened many times. Sometimes they try to keep the sister and brother in the same location. But that's just one of the many stories that take place. Okay, and they had a different system. They had an indenture agreement. Children's Aid Society didn't, because Charles Brace felt indentured service was too reflective of old Europe. So there was a difference in that. There's the Founding Association, and you can go and Google it and see it today. There's Sister Irene, and there's some of the kids that traveled on Sackville, New York in 1901, and Sioux City. There's Paige, Layersburg, and there's a young group of kids. Now, the New York Founding Association shipped a lot of babies. They had baby trains, and it required nurses and nuns to go along with it. Okay, we close to time here. Question comes up. And any of you go to Google. I know some of you, if you're like me, if you see something you don't know anything about it, where do you go? You know Google, don't you? And you know Google is wrong about 70% of the time. And I'm not exaggerating. The internet is not some place to go if you want the truth, the facts. But anyway, you'll read that children were kidnapped from the parents. Did that happen? Yeah. You got this whole yard out here swarming with little kids. And you go out there and you say, hey, Jill, hey, you come here. Who's your parents? I don't know. Well, what's your name? I don't know. When were you born? I don't know. You want to come with me? Hot meal? Hot meal. Yeah, in a bed. Okay. And that's the way it happened. Yeah. You can say it was kidnapped because the kids didn't know. Did they deliberately just take kids? No. But there was some element of truth there. The Catholic Church didn't like the Orphan Train because they criticized them for taking Catholics and turning them into Protestants. Jewish people did too, so that's another story. Fill the labor shortage in the West? You bet. That's what they wanted. They wanted labor. They wanted people to work. What about sexually and physically abused? Yeah, it happened. Just the same as happened today. And people try to put statistics on it and try to say, well, only 10%, only 20%. We don't know. But we know the facts of life, and we know what we have seen in our own communities today. So it did happen. But the kids were given a chance. The parents didn't want the child, or couldn't care for the child, or because of death. And I know sociologists will give me a big argument on this because I've had jump all over you, but my theory is, what I've read and seen, these kids had a chance. That's the 4 million descendants of them, if they know that they come from the Orphan Train. Many of them, if you read books, I would say that any library that has books on the Orphan Train should have the 6 books of stories of Orphan Train writers. You can buy all 6 of them from Concordia, Kansas. It's an Orphan Train complex, they call it. I have one brochure left on that. But anyway, it tells the story of these writers and what they went through. That's another story. I don't have time to tell that. I have 45 minutes, and my 45 minutes are up now, and I don't want to run over. But I tried to highlight some things to you very quickly. And maybe I went a little fast on it. I did because I tried to squeeze a lot in. I hope by using some examples you've got an idea. And one thing I didn't get to about the New York Founding Association, they had nuns with these kids. The priest was the one that did the work of the aged. He knew everybody in his community. And he knew the families. And so he kind of more or less supervised. So the New York Founding Association, the Catholic branch, did have a better system than Children's Aid Society. So, you got any questions? I got 15 minutes for questions. If you don't have any questions, I'll keep on going. Yes.
What happened to the child if he died on the train?
Well, what happened to the child if he died on the train? Now, that didn't happen too often. I don't think, it took place that often, really, because they tried to pick out the healthiest kids they could. If the child had died on the train, and I'm saying this from experience of working on trains, you would stop at the next location, you'd call the sheriff or the authorities, they would come, they'd take the details, and they would remove the body. And then the body would be sent to wherever the sponsor or the, say it's a Children's Aid Society, wherever the agent deemed it necessary.
But there'd be no record of his name because he didn't know who he was.
Well, they had a record. I'll tell you how they got the records. Well, let's use the New York Founding Association. Helen, the girl I told you about in Norfolk, she was found in a cradle in a department store. So they took her to the orphanage, they looked at her and said, well, she's about a day old. So let's go ahead 2 days. We'll make her birth date, and what we think it is today. We'll go ahead 2 days and baptize her. So Helen's record showed her birth date, the date he found her, and then 2 days later have baptismal records. There's no records of parents. I tell you, that's one of the hardest things in the world. I know there's probably people who are experienced this. To go to work and not know your roots, know where you come from. I speak to a lot of school groups. Anywhere from grade schools to smart teenagers. I've even done at college. And, I had to do a program in Sheldon here about 2 years ago. And they were going to bring the public school, parochial school, there's another private school there. All in all, there was 143, I think, 4th and 5th graders. And I never had that in a group. And I asked a girl I graduated from high school who was a teacher, retired teacher, I said, what would you suggest I do? And she looked at me and Rosie said, I'll pray for you. But no, they brought them all in the big gymnasium and sat on the floor. And I found this out when you're talking to kids. The moment you mention orphan, you have got their undivided attention through the whole program till you're done. Yet I've done pretty disruptive high school kids. But when I get into talking about not having parents, there's a common thread there. And not just through death, but otherwise. So it's an issue that is of interest. Real interest. Yes, way back there.
I'm thinking about the foster care system that we have today.
Yes?
But the parents are considered by the court system to be unable to be good parents, and they have to give up their children. They go into the foster system. Then they bounce from one place to another. Sometimes they get adopted, frequently they don't. And when they hit, what is it, the magic age of 16 or 18, they're supposed to be adults, and they're out of the system. Suppose it's 18, I don't know. That's an issue today.
I'm very aware of what you're talking about, but those of you who didn't hear, she's talking about the foster system today. Whether you're taking out of a location, they're giving the foster parents, and the foster parents are not qualified to care for them. And I'm sure you're aware of it. The last 2 years, we've had 3 teenagers, 3, starved to death in their foster homes. I'm sure you read the Dwight's paper. what you know about. And I don't know if anybody works for the children's CAS or department, but from what I see, there's a problem here. And the state seen there was a problem. There was a big shift, a few years ago after the death of I can't remember the details, but I think it was Arnold Kabuchi or something like that. Christine Baker Klein is the head of the New York Foster Parents Association, but she was telling you, this was 3 years ago, I think, when she's at DIAC, that wrote the Orphan Train book. She says the foster children's system in New York is broken. And then in the same sense, I've seen a parent, mother, father, parents, have a child, wonderful home, bright future, fast tracking towards maybe college like that, and the courts have ruled she goes back to a situation where there's no thought of education, the living standards entirely different. You might know what I'm talking about if you read the Dwight History. And there was a person, she did her entire doctoral thesis on the evils of the orphan trade, entirely. And I read it, it's about that thick, I read on. And a lot of it is stuff she got right out of the internet, and rumors and myths. All history has a certain quality of myth to it. If you go back to it and study it, and you can't just read one book. You need to read 2, 3, 4, 5 before you get to fully understand the history you study. I'm reading a book right now, Heyday. It's written about a man, I can't think of the author right now, but he said if there's any period in his life, of the history of this, not his life, but the history of this world, the period he'd most like to live in would be 1850 to 1900. And it's fantastic, some of the things that happened in those 50 years, including our Civil War. To some of you who are interested in children, I would suggest reading this book. I got it on Amazon. It's When Children Become People. And if you really want to understand a little bit, from our children today, I've got 2 grandsons, and so I got a daughter and a son. And how we view our children today is not the way they viewed them in the early 17th, 16th, 15th century. Our aspect of children changed in the 1800s. And it tells us about that. It's an interesting study. It's an academic book. It's hard to read, but it does relate to history of that. Any other questions? Well, I suppose we got to what I might as well keep on going. Okay. If there's no questions, I just want to share this. John Ashe. It's one of thousands of stories. He was traded for a bowl of soup. And I don't have time to tell you this story, but the book, I got the book about him over there. The woman who wrote it challenged me on this when I was talking about this. She said, "Where did you get the fact that he was traded for a bowl of soup?" I said, "Through your book, 2nd chapter, 3rd paragraph." Oh, okay. I think she forgot she put it in. But apparently Pradans is a precursor to the mafia. They roll on the Italy. And they would go through the country and pick up children who weren't wanted. And then they would take them into the city, and they'd put them on the street. They'd give a musical instrument, and they'd play it and collect money. And if they didn't collect money, they didn't get anything to eat that night. When John was taken, his stepmother didn't like him. He was sent to Paris. He worked in the streets of Paris. Apparently, the guy that had him, the Pradhan that had him, decided that maybe pickings are a little bit better in New York. So he got into New York with these kids. I don't know how many he had. but John played a triangle. Well, you know, it doesn't make any difference. He had kids play triangle, violin, or some other musical instrument. It didn't make any difference. You can play it not if you just would arouse the sympathy in somebody and throw in a franc or dollar or whatever. And if you didn't get any money, you were tied to your bed and you didn't get any supper. Because he gave an interview to a newspaper, and it said that he still had the scars on his wrist from where they tied him. But anyway, he was out collecting money, lost, and he didn't know how to get back home. He kind of got away from his general location. He went into this tavern, laid down on a sofa there, and went to sleep. The tavern owner called the Children's Aid Society. They come and got John, took him back to this island, and 2 days later he's on a train to Creswell, Iowa. Him and 6 other boys were given away, and the Moldovan family took him, and the wife happened to be very musical, and he was brought up in that family. That's a picture of him in 1906. He's the last of the old-time bandmasters. He started 19 bands in southern Minnesota and northern Iowa. He was in vaudeville. He was in circus. He performed. He had a traveling band in the state of Iowa. You want to go back in the history books looking for bands in 1900, not that period when he was a great acting man. I got these pictures and information from his grandson, who was still living, and shared a lot of information with me and a lot of other pictures. He had, I think, 4 children, and tremendous person. But it's an example of how, dispute all the things he had been through, what an individual he turned out to be. The story of his life in Cresco and eventually ended up in Osage, it wasn't any problems, abuse, or anything. Everybody was very kind to him and helped him. Okay, I got 2 minutes left. No more questions? So, another thing you're going to hear, if you go to where was the first orphanage in Iowa? And you'll bring it up and it'll say Andrew. And then it was moved to Waverly. Not true. The first orphanage in Iowa was 1854. It was the Orphans Home and Industry founded by a man by the name of Townsend. There's quite a story here. And I got newspaper clippings, a big pile of this. But anyway, what happened was, when you read about the Orphan Train, you read about the Children's Aid Society, and they make it sound like that was the very first orphan train went out in 1853 in May. They were put on a boat and they were shipped across the river over to ended up in Dubuque, Michigan, which is a little village north of Detroit. They had 42 of them. And that story is told in this book here, Brace's book. Pages a ledger of Mr. Taylor, who was the agent. They gave away all but 12 of them. The 12 were put on a train. They were shipped down to Chicago, and they were shipped from Chicago down around in that area by the Rock Island to Iowa City. Now, there was no bridge across the Mississippi then. So the railroad ended there. Then they were put on a wagon, and they were taken to this Orphan's Home of Industry. Those are the first children from the Children's Aid Society, or any other society that actually brought into Iowa under the auspices of the Orphan Train. So that home didn't last very long because people were getting upset with the vandalism and everything. When you take these kids, put them all together in one group, you got problems. If you ship them out, they have them on a farm here and farm here, it's not bad. So okay, that's it. Thanks for coming and listening to me. And if you got any questions, I'll be around here. Try to answer.
Thank you, Dennis. My, that was a very informative and in many ways heart-wrenching story and important insight into our past and certainly in how we deal with children through the years, through the decades. I'm interested in the 3 trains that you mentioned that came through Henry County. I'm assuming on the CP&Q from maybe through Chicago. But if we would go back in newspapers, I know you said that this was advertised on the circulars, but if we would look in our newspaper areas, might we find more information about who the committees were and where the locations were? Do any of you happen to know any family members or anything about these 2 trains in 1898 and one in 1900 that came through Mount Pleasant? Well, it's an interesting insight into a possible extension program. Appreciate it very much. Thank you again. We are so grateful for your research and your presentation to us today. Thank you. Now, more about children. How many of you went to country school? Not as many as I thought, perhaps. But Iowa, according to our presenter next week, Bill Sherman, was the capital of the country in country school. Well, what's the right word? Acquisition. I guess I should read what it says. But the country school capital of America. And we will hear his insight and information presentation about rural country schools in Iowa. And of course, we have several that are still prototypes that are examples in use around the county. And to that point, the Henry County Historic Preservation Commission is preparing a book, The Rural Schools of Henry County. And it's soon to be published by the commission. And one of their members, Aaron Kimsey, will give a brief interview also about Henry County rural schools next week in connection with the program presented by Bill Sherman. William Sherman is the renowned Iowa historian and author who has been exploring for quite some time the dynamic people and the dates around the Iowa Rural Country School movement. So next week, same time, same place, please join us to hear Bill and Aaron talk about rural schools in Iowa and most particularly Henry County. Thank you for coming today.